is when I took the job, I took it with the notion that my bags had to be packed. That I would say what I believed, give my first my professional opinion about anything, and then sometimes a philosophical about city's opinion. I would say what I believe, and if they didn't like it, they should fire me, and that was it. And I really believed that. And it was really important. And that was conscious. I think, and one of the reasons why, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I quit San Francisco was, interestingly, after I had built a house in San Francisco. I bought a property and built a house in San Francisco. And soon after that, I began to realize my bags aren't packed anymore. And I'm vulnerable. And that was one of the reasons why I decided, not the only reason why I decided finally to leave. But there were times like when the mayor, Alioto, was running for his second term. And I get a call one night that the mayor, and I'd gotten along with the mayor just fine, we got along. And the mayor would like you, the mayor's going to be on a boat in the bay tomorrow, talking about San Francisco and the skyline and whatever, and he'd like you to be with him. So there's a TV thing and they're showing him and you together. And, I got along with the mayor just fine. But it took a lot of soul searching. And then I called his staff late that night and said, I'm sorry, I can't be there. That's not what the planning director of the city is supposed to be doing. That's not my job description, because it wasn't him who hired me. And that got me in deep trouble with his staff from then on. But that was all right. Am I answering your question?
Yeah. Let me ask you to finish the thought, because most of the people in the audience here weren't there yesterday afternoon. I think that you were talking about what you viewed as the strengths and weaknesses of landscape architects, and then you made a comment about the limitation of being nice. And can you, just so that the audience isn't mystified by what that was all about, can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, what I meant was that I have observed more and more that in doing good urban design work, I notice that landscape architects are generally very good at it. Relationships of space and buildings and public realm, they do it very well. And I would tend to hire them very quickly if urban design is a matter of substance. But there's a problem, if there's a problem, it's that they tend to be so nice and so accommodating. And that's all. And therefore, some not great stuff that even they don't think is great gets done.
Okay, in a few minutes we're going to open up questions and answers to the audience, so save up your questions, but let me ask you a few more. Let's talk about San Francisco in the near future. There's been a lot of media coverage, even in Southern California, about the impact, the negative side of the success of San Francisco attracting technology companies and also also attracting employees of Silicon Valley to live in San Francisco. The so-called Google buses, or the impact on the immune system, the impact on housing costs. What do you think is the solution to this, given the fact that compared to other cities, San Francisco has a very limited land mass, and I'm sure some people think that the gentrification of San Francisco is a good thing in terms of the tax base for the city, yet it comes at a cost. So what's your prediction of what's going to happen in terms of the relationship between haves and have-nots in San Francisco?
Well, the sad part is that loads and loads of people are being forced out. The Mission District, which for years has been, the home for a large Latino population, is getting forced out. And that means they probably go down to Daly City, South San Francisco, which increases their costs and transportation costs hugely. I think there can be, yes, San Francisco is a limited place, it has a total of 43 square miles, and that's all it is. That's 1/10 the physical size of Los Angeles. But there are more opportunities than one can imagine. And I think that transit along certain areas, if the city is smart enough, it can raise the densities very significantly along such streets as Geary Boulevard. It could raise the densities really much higher, and those would all be people associated with a good transit system. Put a BRT or something like that they will do on Geary. Van Ness has the same ability, less because a lot of that is already developed. There are other areas, such as out at where a lot of the streetcars end in the southern part of the city, but also where two freeways come together. There's a possibility of building a major new dense development there that would house loads and loads of people, very high. So there are opportunities if the city is smart enough to realize it and act on it, and then making sure, as the city of Vancouver does, that huge amounts of that, big serious amounts of that housing will be for moderate and low-income people, will be for, because it can be a new development along the waterfront across from that little area I mentioned yesterday. The dog patch area is going to get developed that way. There are more opportunities within the confines of good urban design and the scale of San Francisco to get than we think about. And I think it takes a whole new look. A problem is that the planning department is not terribly active in this regard, and it responds merely to developers' proposals these days, which is deadly. That's a deadly thing to do. But that's what they're doing.
I think that's true not just in San Francisco, but in a lot of other cities. Planning has become a reactive process. And if anything, I guess what I see is a lot of expansion, or some expansion of jobs, for example, for recent graduates in planning, working in entry-level jobs in planning departments, but largely so that the department can do a better job of responding to proposals coming from developers as opposed to the kind of planning you're talking about.
That's right, and the developers classically want to increase density, the Jacob's truth, universal truth on economic development comes into play, I think, which is, if you believe that a rule or a norm cannot be changed, then it will be economic to develop under the rule or the norm. If you believe that the rule or the norm can be changed, then it will not be economic to develop under the rule or the norm. It's just that simple. That's the basic rule of land economics.
Okay. I want to ask you a question about Tom Maine. I think that you were very vocal in connection with a project that Tom Maine, I think it was a federal building that he designed. And I bring him up because he is of interest to many in the audience here. We gave him an award here a few years ago, and I thought it would be interesting for the students to hear about your reaction to a building Tom Maine designed in San Francisco.
Yeah, he designed a federal building, a federal office building. Well, right now it's interesting. If my wife and I drive to Berkeley, there's a place where you come head on both that and another building. And if Elizabeth is driving, she notes that I do something, and then right after we pass that, she'll say, "You can open your eyes now, Jake, we passed it." Yes, a main building, which is a federal building. It breaks all the rules of the bulk rules of the city. Just breaks them, and they get away with it because it's federal, which is nonsense. We used to have guys try to break them when I was planning director at the feds, and they say, "No, you're going to do it the way we want it, or don't do it. We will find a way to stop you." Well, it's big, it's massive, it has no articulation of the facade. You cannot enter it well. It's just lousy to pass building. That's all I can say. It doesn't fit in with San Francisco at all. If you look at San Francisco, pay any attention to it. In its good parts, it's a little bit like a pointless painting. None of the individual dots and instead of dots saying buildings are particularly great. It's when you put them all together that it's great. You know? And when you begin to change that scale hugely, you can screw it up unless you really know what you're doing. And that's a Tom Maine operation. Did he do did he or somebody else do the library in Seattle?
Anybody know who was the architect of the library in Seattle?
That's cool. That's another building which is supposedly terrific inside. But look how that addresses the street. Really terrific. I really suggest to everybody along this line, this general subject matter. There's a new book out by Johnny Lerner called Urban Acupuncture. It is a spectacular book. It's all short little essays. And it's about issues like this, about small things in cities that can be just grand. I can't recommend a book more strongly. Urban Acupuncture. What are the little things in a city that you can do to make it great?
Good. One last question before we open this up to the audience. The readers of Great Streets can see that at many points within the book, you're very specific about what you think is the right way to do things. For example, at one point on page 281, you write, none of the very best streets can be characterized as having tall buildings. The height of buildings along the best streets is less than 100 feet. And there are other places within the book where you talk about the proper spacing of trees along the street. Your book is quite prescriptive. So this is leading to a question that I wanted to ask on behalf of a planner. Some in the audience may know James Rojas, who used to work, I think he still works at LA County Metro, a proponent of what is called Latino urbanism. And when I sent James an announcement that you were going to come speak here, he responded via Facebook, quote, "Yikes, every street has to be like Paris!" Exclamation mark. And then I contacted James to ask him, what do you mean by that? And he said to me that a few years ago, he was speaking on a panel with you at a UCLA conference in Little Tokyo here in LA. And he said he got into an argument with you about whether your approach was too, perhaps, Eurocentric, and that you tended to be prescriptive about things like the best streets not having buildings more than 100 feet, or that trees have to be a certain number of feet apart, and that you were not open enough to what he described as, quote, a more organic approach and a different approach to order on what he was calling Latino streets. So even though James is not here, I promised him I would ask you to respond to this. In other words, whether your approach is too Eurocentric and that you're not open to other ways of defining order on the street other than a Parisian model.
Well, if you look at the book more carefully, after doing a small residential street in Pittsburgh as an example of a great street, a small residential street, it's anything but Parisian, it's anything but Euro-centered. Then after that, the next two streets in the book are about the Via dei Giubilari in Rome and the Great Street in Copenhagen. And those are anything but Parisian. They're anything but grand. They're narrow. They're, then somewhere along the line, there are, when I talk about once great streets, the two ones that I picked the Grand Boulevard in Paris as a once great street. The funny thing is, since I wrote that in the book, they've redone the street, and it's good now. It's better. It's better. And Market Street as a once great street, is a grand street. So, you pick what you want regarding the height and regarding the trees. Those are simple observations. I wasn't, and I say somewhere in there about the height that it probably can be bigger in places, but what it's related to is the scale of the street. That, I didn't say it, the ancients said it, it's before grandness. The ancients said that the height along the street should be at least half the width of the right-of-way to define the street. Well, that's what I'm concerned with. That's really what I'm concerned with. As far as the trees, and the tree spacing, if you spend enough time counting, measuring distances between trees and distance between a corner and a tree, then you get to know and you get to make judgments, and I do make judgments about, you know, where they work and where they don't. And I think that my spacing is somewhere between 15 and 35 feet. Well, that's, you know, that's pretty big. And then it's the type of tree and a lot of other things get into that subject matter. So tell him, I said, if he's going to pursue that, if he's going to bug up, then he gets his head on that too.
Okay, I'll convey that to him. All right, so let's open up the questions to the audience. Open up to the audience. Anybody have any questions for Professor Jacobs? I'll bring you the microphone.
You said that architects have 3 roles. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. And then also,
I didn't say 3 roles. I said that the incoming head of Harvard Graduate School of Design said that. One was as designers, one was as researchers, and one was as city planners. I didn't say that.
being that engineers, architects, and city planners all work together, what should their relationship be like? Their work? Being that engineers, architects, and city planners all have a work relationship, what should that be like when you guys come together?
Hopefully cooperatively, they should work together. Hopefully, and they do have to work together. And I don't think that's terribly difficult. I think you get into problems often. Well, I have more problems with anybody else as a city planner. I have more problems over the years with traffic engineering, but all than any other group. I also have trouble with whether they're traffic or other engineers regarding certain physical parameters, radii at corners, things like that. The width of lanes, standards that to me don't make much sense. But one tries to work together. You prove your point, or they prove theirs. You've got to do it together as best you can. The best situations are indeed where you do work together, working with the engineers and planners and architects doing the street that we were involved in Bothell, Washington, just outside of Seattle, was such an example.
Professor Jacobs, let me ask you to expand on this a little. Yesterday we got into this. I'm sure that over at the College of Engineering, they're having meetings like this right now about how can they deal with these pesky architects and planners and landscape architects. But coming back to how should engineers be educated, or are there ways in which we as environmental design professionals can help to subvert the education of engineers so that they would have a better understanding of what is really needed? And also, let me ask you to talk about that example you gave yesterday. I can't remember the exact context, but it was something about a discussion or an interaction you were having with an engineer about the spacing between people somewhere with a radius around people.
I was talking about, well, what I observed, what I'm increasingly observed, is that the engineers, particularly traffic engineers, have had a major say in creating standards of space. And they get listened to, and they hold the fort, especially in things like width of traffic lanes. They gotta be 12 feet when 3 meters will do just fine, and that's less than 10 feet, and then other people, the pedestrian-oriented people, the bicycle-oriented people, in order to get their share of the right-of-way, they increasingly, I find, set their own standards, like the width of a bike lane has to be so wide. 6 feet for a two-way, 3 feet minimum for one-way. I'm not so sure about that. And then the one I gave yesterday, the example yesterday, the transit people. Was working in Vancouver, and the transit people say you've got to have roughly 90 centimeters by 1 meter for people, for queuing space for every person queuing. That's what you got. That's a standard. Where did you get that standard? And they say, oh, we've been using that standard for a while now. I said, no, that's not answering the question. Where did you get the standard? And they can tell you various hokey things. And I said, no, that's not an answer either. And so I measured off 90 centimeters by a meter on the floor where we were, in the meeting where we were, and I stood in it. I said, oh, look, there's plenty of space around me. Look, I can stand here. And I said, would you come and stand next to me in this space? And the person did. Oh, look, we can both stand here. And there's still space. Would you come in and stand here too? And oh, we're beginning to touch. I don't know how bad it is, but our clothes and arms are beginning to touch a little bit. I'm not going to use your standard. And if you give me a hard time about this, when this plan, we're designing Granville Street in Vancouver, when you give me a hard time about this in front of City Council, I'm going to do this example. I'm going to do exactly this example. How are you going to feel when I do that in front of you? Because that's what I'm going to do. And so we didn't use that standard. But you got to do that. The worst, the toughest, really toughest ones on this are not the engineers. I'm not loving the standard. But the fire departments. Oh my God. What you run into with them will drive you nuts. Could drive you absolutely nuts. And the street in San Francisco that Elizabeth and I designed, Octavia Boulevard, has side access lanes that are 18 feet wide for both parking and a go lane, and it should be 16. There's no reason for it to be more than 16. But 2 feet are damn important because you got 2 of them. It's 4 feet. I could do a lot with that 4 feet. And that's because of the fire department.
Okay, thanks. Now the question of Professor Luis Hoyos.
Professor Jacobs, it's great to finally meet you. And I wish I could spend the whole day with you, quiz you, but anyway. Some of us here teach the urban design studio, and happily it's been cross-disciplinary with landscape. So we do explore that idea of getting along and to make the architects reason with landscape architects and make the landscape architects hold their ground. And but anyway, that's we use LA, of course, as a laboratory for exploring urban design, which is great for the good parts and the bad parts. I'm curious about your take on what that the profession of urban design, I'm a fan of this new step, late 50s, and now it's beginning to mature. And we teach our students, of course, to be innovative, right? The Tom Hayes model, of course. When it gets to urban design, when they confront the outside world, they very often confront the orthodoxy of guidelines. Actually, we teach them to deal with guidelines in urban design. I wonder what's your take on that? And after you settle into the question, could you help me position in your mind the CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism, and their outsized influence in the profession now?
Okay. Are you familiar with the San Francisco Urban Design Plan? Well, apparently I didn't know it, but the San Francisco Urban Design Plan was apparently the first one of its kind that deals with the whole city. And it doesn't so much as give guidelines as it gives, as I said, principles. And they're all drawn, very, very clearly, I believe. And they, and it doesn't give guidelines so much. And I think that's important. What are you trying to achieve? What is it you're trying to achieve? Ultimately, some of them do come down to some laws, like the height laws, like the bulk laws. And those are not negotiable. I'm very watchful of things that are in the American society that are negotiable. Because, in other words, to use city planning parlance, most negotiable things come under, they come to a public hearing because under what's called conditional uses. Something that you can have if it meets certain conditions. It wouldn't be normal, it wouldn't be something you would normally do, but you could do it if it meets conditions. And once you get into that, and planning has become that more and more in California, discretionary reviews, things like that, the under your discretion. The planner is in deep trouble once you go there. Because in that situation, when things are negotiable, my understanding of this society that we live in is that the person who wins, or the side that wins, is the side with the most power. To take it the next step in this society, the side with the most power is the side with the most money. To then go one step further and just really to the conclusion, that person or that side is never the city planner. You don't have, that's not what you have. You don't have that. You don't have money, so you would have that power, basically. And that's why I like not to use, and I've given talks about it, not using discretionary review of things. why in San Francisco. It's interesting. It's with discretion and all that, but discretion not about development, but why do the Department of Public Works in San Francisco for years was getting rid of the cable cars and the street cars. They got rid of loads of cable cars, loads of street cars. And that was discretion, their discretion. And they had power, other people didn't have power. Till one lady, it's always a lady in San Francisco, till one lady, Frida Klissman, realized there aren't going to be any more cable cars very soon. So she got the cable car, she got signatures and enough to put it on the ballot. And all the cable cars that remained had to remain. And that's why we have the cable cars. 2 years later, she began thinking about it. She said, well, why is it that the trains, you know, the passenger trains have lost all their passengers? And one of the reasons is they changed all of their schedules so that the trains came into stations at terrible times. And no one would get on them, you know. So you get to stop the train service. She would got another question on the ballot. Do you know that the schedules of the cable cars in San Francisco are in the city charter? That's how the pay was saved. People make things into a law. It's important to know. Okay, regarding the newer business. It's when they go over the top and try to write the same sort of stuff that get me in trouble. Other than that, I thought well of them, in all honesty. It's when Andrews Duaney goes over the top, you know, that it gets to be a little crazy. And, you can't. To set rules that are not rules. You fall into the same thing others fall into. At the same time, some of the things they do are really that they've actually done are quite good. The seaside thing down in Florida was really well done, I think.
Okay, more questions from the audience. Who else has a question? Come on, there must be some student. You already asked one. Well, I'll come back to you if nobody else. Come on, who else has a question for Professor Jacobs? Okay.
So yesterday you talked about how streets are best when there's a great communication between the vehicles and the pedestrians. What is your take on the new sustainable acts within like walkable communities where they are looking to eliminate the vehicles from the communities?
They're eliminating vehicles?
Yes.
If there are enough people walking, using, cycling, then it may make very little sense. But if you think about all the space of the right of way, all the space of the right of way, and how much of that is for vehicles, then take away the vehicles, and in a strange way, and sometimes those streets can be really dead because you don't have enough movement and activity on them. One of the first cities that did it years and years ago was Toledo, Ohio. And at first it worked well, and then you realized, wow, there's not enough people down here in downtown Toledo to really populate that that street. So I think I do things that counts. And you gotta, if I want to get 12 to 15, 20 people per meter width per minute without the cars, well, that's going to be a lot of people. That's going to be a pretty good people street. Once it's going to go much, much, much lower than that, I'm not so sure. The vehicles aren't hurting it necessarily. Is that answering your question?
Okay, next question. Oh, right over here.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. By the way, I came last night and heard you last night, and you had spoke about magic, about the component of magic. So what my question is if you can pick out like 3 or 4 streets that absolutely had that magic, which were your favorites?
Which 3 or 4 streets do you think have the most magic? And I was going to ask you a related question, which is if some rich person were to endow a Alan B. Jacobs Institute of city making or street making, what cities and what streets would you say that fellows of the Jacobs Institute should be sure to see? But the student's question is 3 or 4 magical streets. Which 3 or 4 streets do you think are most magical that people should see?
Well, I've already said the Via dei Giubilari in Rome. That's a magical street. I think Strøget in Copenhagen is along that line. Not quite as good. Why am I running into a dead head in my head? Yeah, get it up.
That's why
Get it up. Right. Yeah, the Paseo di Grazia is a great street. You know, it's overused right now. It's become overused, let's say. For a quiet Paseo in Barcelona, the Court Mirabeau in Aix-en-Provence is a really special street. It's a grand street. The Grand Canal, or any number of the canals in Amsterdam are great streets. They're really great streets. Those would be the favorites. Those would be the most favorite, I think. In terms of groups of streets, for me it's Bologna. For me it's